first and foremost, I would just do a back of the envelope and say, what's the number that I could go after? And I would pick a number that would scare me, but still within bounds. Like let's not say, you're going to be the next Google. And then say, how do I collect a few proof points to show that this is really the opportunity and convince a set of my colleagues that we should go after this? That's activity one. And then activity two would be, how do I get started by creating the momentum that this is possible by picking one use case to get going before I pull the whole machine? And the whole machine gives you more impact, but creating conviction and momentum is super important.
From McKinsey & Company, I'm Sean Brown, and welcome to Inside the Strategy Room. You just heard our guest, Zach Gaibi, discussing how the mid-sized companies that he works with start on their transformation journey. And that's our theme today, how midcaps can seize opportunity to transform themselves to reach a significantly higher level of performance. Zach is a senior partner in our South Africa office, and he leads our transformation practice across Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. He's worked extensively with both private equity portfolio companies and family-owned businesses across the midcap space. Zach, welcome to the podcast.
Fantastic to be here.
Also with us today is Kedar Nayak. Kedar is a partner in our Brussels office and has deep experience in growth marketing and sales. He's served more than 20 midcap companies across Europe, India, and the Middle East. Kedar, it's great that you could join us.
Fantastic. Great to be here. Thank you.
And finally, we have Mauricio Hanaskis. He's the managing partner of our Chile location, and he's the leader of our transformation practice in Spanish Latin America. Mauricio has led transformations across a wide range of sectors, serving conglomerates, family-owned groups, and private equity firms. Mauricio, welcome.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
Mauricio, could you kick us off by sharing your perspective on why mid-sized companies really need to be thinking more about transforming?
Thank you so much. So in terms of context, we live in a very special moment. So the pace of change in our world has become exponential. We have seen massive reduction in the cost of electric batteries in the last 10 years. We have seen how houses can be built in 24 hours. And, the amount of data and the fact that, cost for data has gone down massively in recent years. This just shows, the pace that, mid-cap companies also face in the day-to-day.
So they need to keep up with an increasing pace of change in the business world, right? But why is McKinsey and why were you studying this? What role do midcaps play in the global economy?
So they account approximately 30% of the global economy in terms of GDP. We speak around about 50,000 midcap companies all over the world, and they employ even a higher share, almost 40% of the global formal workforce. They're pretty much relevant all over the world, with some geographies like Asia, Middle East, or Latin America, where they even take an even higher share of their economies.
So before we go much further, how did you and your colleague define midcaps?
Sure. Today, we will say that, if you look at sales or revenues of the companies, we look in the range of, 200 million to 2 billion. That said, in some geographies, the 200 might move into the 100. And in some geographies, the 2 billion will be slightly higher.
So in some smaller markets, I suppose, a mid-sized company might also be smaller. So you've established that midcaps are important, but why do you think midcaps are well positioned for transformation? And did you look at all sectors?
So an important point when we look at the performance of big companies, and we chose 5 relevant sectors of the economy: apparel, commodity and chemicals, pharma, technology, and semiconductors. There is significant difference between the mid-cap companies that are leading their sectors and those that are, lagging in their sectors. So the opportunity that we've been looking at is how do we take the laggards into, the average or beyond, and how do we even help the leaders of the industry go even faster and even improve their performance. So we've done quite an extensive research over the last few years. Over the last 5 years, we have served and transformed over 800 companies all over the world. We have done structured interviews with the C-level of 1,200 executives. And we have data in our databases of 20,000 companies in this space.
Got it. So beyond this performance spread that you just discussed, what do you find are some of the biggest challenges or perhaps drivers of that spread that are unique to midcaps? Kedar, maybe you want to take that one?
If you take the research that Mauricio talked about, and if you look at the challenges that come out, there are 7 of them that stand out. I'm sure there's an 8th, but let's talk about the big ones. The first one is the inability of mid-cap companies to assess what's the full potential. So if the company were to perform at its max potential performance, what could it look like? And that's probably likely because the peer set is not that clear. You probably don't know what the best in class out there looks like. So that's one piece that we find challenging. Hence, it's difficult for them to set the right bar. The second is they are sometimes too concentrated in one or two geographies, one or two end market segments, which makes them extremely vulnerable in case of any disruptions. I'm aware of a mid-cap company that was operating in China in the automotive space. And then during COVID, they had a significant challenge. And literally the company was fighting for solvency. The third, if you look at the leadership bench, and if you look at all improvement initiatives, or most of them go through the same 3, 4, 5 key individuals. I once had a CEO of a mid-cap company telling me, look, all these ideas are great, but look, I have 5 people who need to carry the brunt. So let's actually sharply prioritize. So that's sort of the third challenge. The fourth, given the family-owned nature or the private equity-owned nature, sometimes there is very limited separation between professional management and ownership. And the governance tends to get a bit muddled, which creates challenges in terms of sort of the short-term versus the long-term outlook and the trade-offs linked to that. The fifth is when you compare them to larger institutions who have access to a larger talent pool, larger innovation pool, larger capital, they have limited access to some of these things, which make them very difficult to make the step change. The sixth, often the decision-making in companies is experience-based, judgment-based, intuition-based, just given the low maturity of data, process, system landscape that they live. And the last one is the collective experience in the organization to live through a change program is not that high. I was once talking to a chemical site, and the clients basically said, look, we haven't done a lean program here since 1980s. So this is sort of 20, 25 years of organizational inertia leads to limited change appetite.
Indeed, I'd imagine it would. So lots of challenges, but there are also some benefits, yes? Perhaps you could take us through some of the strengths that midcaps can leverage that give them an edge over larger competitors.
It's a great question. Thank you. To my mind, there are 3 clear benefits that midcap companies have. One is the agility, the entrepreneurial agility, the organizational agility and speed of decision making is significantly faster. And by the way, in our experience, decisions, the time from decision to action is quite high. So that's number one. Number two, there's deep content expertise and deep knowledge. Because you operate in limited segments, limited geographies, you typically tend to have grown in a very deep expertise in certain areas. The third tends to be the passion and the culture that companies like these have, and also the talent pool that exists tends to stay longer just because, there's affiliation, there is sort of, passion about it. These are the 3 that come to my mind.
Thanks, Kedar. So given the spread in performance that you found amongst the midcaps in any given industry, could you just take us through some of the factors that help the leaders outperform their peers or perhaps transform in order to do so?
First and foremost is the bold aspiration and purpose. And what we mean by that is, what is the change story that you would actually tell the organization and why you're doing this? It can't just be a simple cost-cutting mission of sorts, or it can't just be, I'm going to improve EBITDA. But why are we actually doing this? People need to understand that along the way, and a purpose behind it. And especially in companies that have social missions or partial social missions, I think it's quite important if you don't mobilize. We work with a bunch of healthcare companies, and you will lose people immediately if it's all about profit. So why are we doing this? And the second part of the bold aspiration also has to be a fact-based view on what is a true potential. And I think Kedar pointed to earlier was that one of the pitfalls that we see is if you're a mid-cap or a non-public company, sometimes you don't know what the edge is. So this is, again, a change narrative of why we're doing this, combined with, what is a true ambition, and how, if we push this to the edge, what would it take to grab the full ambition. The second one is, how do we really invest ahead of the curve on talent, which is what we find is oftentimes is that smaller and mid-cap companies are quite cautious on talent. And an example of that is if you think about some of the Gen AI stuff that's going on and the analytics efforts that are going on, people are very, very cautious. But for example, we have one client that's reduced their inbound call volume as a services company by over 60% simply because they leaned in quite heavily and went and got a few folks that understood how to use generative AI to automate many of the tasks that they were doing. The third one is the notion of how do you really align the incentive structure along the lines of whatever change you're putting in place, as we referred to in number one, and how do you align yourself and your leaders against hitting those targets. The fourth one is the prioritization. And what we mean by that is, many organizations have what I would call zombie initiatives that they've been working on for years. And so how do you really force yourself to say, what are truly, truly the priorities that we're going after?
So if you could go back to that first point, what's the actual process of setting the collective bold aspiration? How do the best midcaps really deeply engender that ambition throughout their workforce?
Let me try to answer that. The boldness really occurs if at least a few members of the top team decide that we are going to venture on a journey of taking this particular institution to the next level. If that ambition level isn't there, this thing just falls apart, right? You can do the world's best benchmarking, nobody's going to care. It needs to be an aligned ambition as well. It doesn't mean you need every single person at the top aligned to it, but you need sort of the vast majority of it because this is painful to do. The rewards are there at the back end, but it is painful to go through. That's one. The second part of this is really getting a fact base around what is the true potential. I think what the mid-cap folks do is take several weeks to very quickly gauge and say, we think that the ambition level is going to be 20 or 30% higher. Are we in the right zip code? Is it scary enough? And if that number is not scary, then it's not an ambition, then it's incremental change. So I think that's the second step they do. And then thirdly is then they go through some of the mechanics of how do we set up the organization to go after this. So again, once you align around the ambition, both in the aspiration and the change story and also the numbers, then you start setting up the infrastructure, including the incentive structure to go capture this, right? That's kind of the high level process, if you will.
So Mauricio, are there any experiences from your client work that you can share to illustrate how companies have gone about this ambition setting successfully?
In my experience in these cases, the looking at what other companies in other markets have done in their space, it gives them a lot of confidence, particularly looking at companies of similar size. And the second thing, creating, as Zach was saying, creating real conviction, not just at the owner group or founder, that in many cases it is in the company. It's really creating conviction in the full C-suite, but also moving that down so that everyone in the organization knows why we're doing this and why this aspiration is feasible.
So on this point about creating conviction about the transformation goals, what's the process there and how do you ensure that you're involving the broader organization?
So what we find is that once you actually have a concrete set of ambition in terms of targets and then the corresponding initiatives, you generally get 4.5x improvement. And what do we mean by initiatives is the following, which is once you set the ambition, how do you break that ambition down to the Lego blocks or the Lego bricks that you can mobilize 20 to 30% of the organization to work on? So if you're doing pricing, then the pricing initiative will say, okay, we're going to change pricing on all our major accounts. And that should give us $200,000 of lift. But then how do you break up the major accounts into smaller initiatives that each person individual is accountable for? And so you have 5 to 7 people that are driving a separate initiative, but that all ties back up to the original target that you had. That's when you really get the impact because now you have an ambition number and you've mobilized at least 20 to 30% of the organization to be actively involved in pushing this change journey with you.
Thank you. That sounds great. But many people are also motivated by incentives. What role does equity participation among employees play as a role in fostering this sense of engagement? Or are there any other types of incentives that companies use successfully to drive this?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of ways we keep folks aligned. One is obviously there's a financial incentive, and that financial incentive can have a couple of different parts to it. But the most important part is for the specific set of ideas that you are driving as an individual, how do we ascribe some value to it? So when that idea converts to cash flow for the business, how do you get a certain percent of it? And and again, this is not awarding business investment banking bonuses, but it's something meaningful that makes people feel appreciated. We actually had one client that paid for a relatively junior person because that person really drove a ton of impact. They got a special bonus that all helped them pay off their mortgage. This is not PE money, but this makes a big difference to many of the folks that are involved in these transformations. The second type of incentive that we've often seen that's quite encouraging is that often these programs get a lot of executive attention. And so a lot of younger folks will actually look at this and say, wow, this is a great way for me to get exposure and to rise. We work with an agri company, as a midcap agri company, and the CEO there picked 2 or 3 of these folks that were, more entry-level folks that were doing quite well and promoted them during their transformation. And that really caught everybody's attention. And that was more powerful than the financial incentives. And then all of a sudden, we had many more people coming through with, hey, I have 5 other ideas we can go work on, right? That was kind of the way folks got mobilized and motivated to help.
I think of incentives as in 3 buckets. There is economics, so it's eco. There is ego, right? So you get some of the younger colleagues and give them the forum, etc. But I think there's a third one, which is emotional, right? So one of my client said, look, why don't we think about the journey of our lives, right? This is going to be the adventure of our lives. We have friends. We're going to sort of do this. And I can tell you, the team that started out, I think there's probably 10% of them who left after a 10-year journey. And literally people sort of went through it because it was an emotional exercise and everybody felt connected to it. Yes, there is equity involved. Yes, there is all of that. But I think let's not forget the emotional part, especially around, these mid-sized companies. There's something to that.
That's a great point, Kedar. And one of the things that Zach said earlier in terms of framing this transformation opportunity was the importance of creating a fact base. What should that include?
The fact base has got a couple of elements. There's an element of sort of data, benchmark, analysis, etc., right, which puts out the right ambition versus the market versus your peers. At the same time, there's one thing which we call the McKinsey Transformation Index. It's a shared belief across the leadership team and across the organization, how we are doing across various dimensions of impact and various dimensions of reinvention, business reinvention. And I take the example of, it's a heavy fossil fuel driven midcap. They wanted to accelerate their journey on sustainability, right? Because they felt they were lagging their peers and they were lagging what the market needed. What they did was they did a very clear benchmark across these dimensions internally, but also externally versus peers. And then they basically said, look, we are lagging the market, and they use it as a call for action to drive something like this. So you need a fact base, both analytic, but also sort of on practices and where you stand with your peers as a call to action. So I think the way to think about it is, where do you want to be based on what your market needs?
Thanks so much, Kedar. You mentioned earlier that one of the challenges that midcaps face is that they often have significantly less mature data and IT systems. During a transformation, do those companies also try to transform their technology and data systems?
You could literally say, look, I'll first fix all of those things and then think about it. But this is an example of a chemical company which is actually saying, you know what, we are going to leapfrog. We are going to go from our fragmented data set to actually use digital analytics and Gen AI as a way to sort of reimagine our sales engine. So they think about, why does my salesperson need to spend 5 hours creating a customer value proposition? Can I do it in a fast way? Is there a way in which we can sort of, a salesperson gets a nudge saying, look, here's a summary of the last meeting that you had. Here's the two things that have moved since then. Here's sort of a couple of things that's out there.
Thank you. So let's double click on that point. What kind of impact do you see Gen AI having in midcaps right now? Zach said they're often very cautious about implementing new technologies. Could this technology really help them level the playing field with large companies?
On the Gen AI, I mean, let's just be honest. The jury is out about what this could lead to. I think everybody is convinced there is a clear sort of bunch of hero use cases, whatever you want to call it, that we're going to reimagine the way business runs using Gen AI. That is a fact. The extent of it is still being tested. However, I do believe that there are at least a few areas where we see a clear step change in productivity coming from that. If I take innovation, science, and research, if I take even the whole back office and the way we think about administrative sort of things, it is completely rechanging a lot about it.
Yeah, look, Gen AI is taking the world by storm. Anything around customer interaction, service operations, and the like, I think there's a quite an emerging amount of case law on how we've scaled that. When it comes to industrial clients, I think we're still earlier in adoption. So in fact, I just had a discussion today with an industrial client where we run a proof of concept where we're taking Gen AI, we've loaded up all their manuals for all maintenance work for a lot of heavy duty machinery. And this Gen AI prototype tells you, the technician on the front line that says if a particular machine goes down or a light comes on and says, hey, this machine had the following procedure done 2 months ago. So it's likely that this is what's wrong, and please do the following. And so that, again, that's proof of concept, right? But they're interested in saying, how do we scale that? And as a way to leapfrog their competitors on cost position. And again, same company with the proof of concept, they had their maintenance staff walk around with these headsets that have these cameras that do real-time scans. And when the maintenance staff hits click, that picture is compared to a library of pictures, including those on the web. And it says, hey, this particular pipe looks frayed enough that this is not best practice. And it pops back and says, this is what best practice looks like. You might want to consider replacing this pipe. So this is not Star Trek anymore. It's here. And I think there's a lot of room for innovation and experimentation. And I think by the end of 2024, you are going to see a lot more scaling, even in the industrial space.
That does indeed sound exciting. So given the potential of a digital transformation to scale, what are some of the typical enablers or blockers that you might see? I'm mindful of the point Kedar made earlier about the lack of good data to support decisions. So how do you build that?
Yeah. I think I heard this expression once, I forgot from whom. It was something around the lines of like, don't digitize waste and don't waste digital. And in this particular case, what we did is we said, before we do anything with digital, are there basic blocking and tackling things that we can do? And there were a lot of basics that were just missing. So let's not worry about getting sexy right away. So that was sort of part one. Part two is once we had that in place, we said, how do we go to battle with the data we have versus the data we want, right? To borrow a expression from some military person. And on that one, you can start with smaller sprints as opposed to having these grand visions of, so let's pick a couple of use cases where we can really, really make a difference.
Thanks, Zach. So companies that are moving along this transformation journey, what kind of changes do you see in their governance that might take place, or perhaps that should take place that maybe aren't?
Yeah. So I think private equity portfolio companies, we've worked with a bunch of them that are sort of near the exit window. And then we would work with them and say, how do you work on this mid-cap company to get it ready for either a IPO or a sale to another fund or some other exit? And in that instance, particularly if they're looking at an IPO, they do at some point have a clear transition plan that says we need a public company, a CFO with public company experience. We do need a slightly different board and the like, right? So those are things that they start planting the seeds on quite early. We work with a AI-enabled company that was part of a Fortune 500 company, and they haven't exited yet because of the markets. But part of that process was they actually brought in a new head of the business unit because they said, we are going to take this AI unit and we're going to go public at some point. And so they brought in a CEO or head of the business unit who is going to become the CEO once they go public with a pretty extensive public company background. And they have sort of said, we have an initial board, an internal board, and we will need to transition that out over time. So those are the major sort of steps that they take. And then they also work with, an investment bankers or some other financial advisors on what would it take to get the best valuation when they exit.
Thank you. So another topic that's high on many CEOs' minds is the current geopolitical climate and overall uncertainty, especially with regards to supply chains. How are you seeing that affect midcaps and how are they responding? Mauricio?
So we shared at the beginning, one of the challenges that we see in the midcap space is the fact that, they might be less diversified than some of the larger global companies. So that is indeed a risk. Eventually it could be a benefit, but, in many cases it's a risk. So what we've seen is, number one, trying to increase their diversification into other markets or segments to avoid that level of risk. The second one is that in some cases their perception of risk is lower in some markets that they know better than the global companies, and eventually they could even take an opportunity as they are faster and quicker to react in some of those markets when the opportunities open up. So I would say it is a fact. It's part of the context. And what we've seen in some cases is, ensure growth through diversifications to avoid, too much weight on one market. And on the other side, in some aspects, the ability to do it faster than some of the larger companies.
Zach, Kedar, anything you want to add there?
I think it is good for companies to play out scenarios and actually stress test their robustness of the business model in multiple scenarios. I often feel that mid-cap companies tend to get too action-oriented and too operational, too fast, and don't take the strategic step back that you sometimes should in these things, right? So that's, I think, the one thing I would add.
So you've covered several dimensions of what a mid-cap transformation should focus on. Is there an example that you can share of how a mid-cap company actually put those steps into action?
Yeah. So this is a payroll software company, privately owned. They were looking for an exit. But what happened, obviously, during COVID was the macro conditions, and they had an aged product portfolio versus some of the startups and the like, was causing quite a drag. And so very quickly, within weeks, we said, what is the true ambition level that they should be going after? And we came up with a pretty sizable number in the order of 50 to 100 million for them that they thought they could, they were scared by, but they thought, okay, let's go for it. And the secret ingredient here really was the CEO, probably one of the most humble and open-minded executives I've ever worked with in terms of, hey, let's go try this out. Let's bring people along. And how do we really make this happen? We said, you're a mid-cap company. How do we quickly get some cash in the bank? And that was done through the first wave of pricing work. And it was, how do we find accounts that we can reprice given their value proposition? And then they also set the stage for what are the new pricing structure we can use once we have our go-to-market model sorted out, once we have our product portfolio sorted out, right? So that was sort of wave one. Then the next thing that they set to do was service operations, which is, all their customer interactions and the like. And they're acutely called it old school and AI enabled. And on the old school stuff, there was a lot of basic blocking and tackling. And I think that actually gave them the courage to say, okay, now how do we lean in and go do something that's AI enabled, right, to reduce the service operations cost? And then once they had sort of what I call the cash in the bank, then they went after the product portfolio and the go-to-market model, particularly around building capabilities for their sales force, 6% increase in top line, over 35% increase in EBITDA. But I think, again, if you interview the CEO, he would say, this happened to be a cultural transformation that was enabled by, all this value we generated. Because I think at the back end of this, what they got was a workforce that was truly mobilized. I think at that peak of it, they had close to 40% of their employees were running one or more of these ideas or initiatives down. Number two is they took one of their mid-level employees and made her what they called her chief transformation officer. And now she did so well. She's, sort of grown into a chief operating officer role. and the company's like set quite well to exit.
Thank you, Zach. That's a great example. Mauricio, anything from your experience you'd like to add?
Yeah, I'll share the impact in a situation that we've seen in Latin America, a company in the downstream gas space, relatively flat growth. And the company, was a concern on some of the disruptions that might come in the following 10 years. And what they did was trying to reinvent their business, twofold. So number one, bringing digital across the business, so both to the sales side of the company and to the operations. So they moved quickly in less than 2 years from selling 10% of their total sales digitally to 45. They are even more these days. The second thing is that they brought analytics, particularly to their operations, to improve, logistics, manufacturing, and a few other things, generating significant more margin by doing these kind of things and automating part of the functions. They also looked creatively into new markets, to improve the supply. They reduced the cost by 20%. And then they didn't only focus on trying to do things better in their existing space, but find new venues for growth. And while they did something on the geography side, they much more looked into new opportunities. So they developed new businesses. They launched some of them. They bought some of them. They got into the startup space, trying to leverage some of the synergies with the existing client base. So they did a pretty nice job in terms of reviving growth, both by looking better into their day-to-day operations, but changing it significantly the way they work.
So we talked about transformations of sales and talent. What are you seeing in terms of the back office functions and the midcap transformations you're working on?
Look, on the back office perspective is, if it's a family-owned business, sometimes they're lean, mean, and super lean and mean, right? But let's just take the typical midcap. And this goes back to a little bit of sometimes you don't know what you don't know. But if we look at the really innovative midcaps, what they do is they literally will take a clean sheet of paper and say, forget about what back office I have. If I were to start this all over again, what would I actually need? And then how do I build up from that? So an example of that is, we worked with a company in the tech space, and they actually had a pretty bloated, everybody knew was the finance organization was bloated. And you would never guess that the biggest driver of all the excess folks was actually the CFO's office. And again, it was taking a clean sheet of paper and saying, if we really were to do this from scratch, what's required from a regulatory perspective and what's really required for us to run the business, you can come up with a much smaller answer. And this was independent of tech, independent of any other investments, right? That's one.
Got it. Thank you. So what should be the first steps that midcap leaders take to really enable a full transformation?
You basically have a short, top-down diagnostic ambition setting up front. You take specific benchmarks, but you use a sprint logic of designing and implementing. So it's not like you have a long design and then an implementation. You go in waves, because remember, you have a thin leadership bench. So you only push 2, 3, 4 things at a given point of time and create a self-funding mechanism to focus on the right things in a gradual way. While at it, you set up the whole transformation cadence to drive change, to drive culture, to drive the right ownership mindset, to build the right capabilities, and to create a performance engine.
Yeah, I would say first and foremost, I would just do a back of the envelope and say, what's the number that I could go after? And I would pick a number that would scare me, but still within bounds. Like let's not say, you're going to be the next Google. And then say, how do I collect a few proof points to show that this is really the opportunity and convince a set of my colleagues that we should go after this? That's activity 1. And then activity 2 would be, how do I get started by creating the momentum that this is possible by picking one use case to get going before I pull the whole machine. And the whole machine gives you more impact, but creating conviction and momentum is super important. Those are the things I would do.
Mauricio, anything you'd add?
Number one, I would say, if you are more in the growth mode, are you growing enough? Are you being cautious? Or, are we really, stressing the opportunity that you have in front of you? And the second thing is, are you creating something that is going to sustain over time? So not just making sure that you are going after the right opportunities, but you are creating both the capabilities in your organization, the talent that is going to be able to scale this moving forward. So I will push, whoever is leading a midcap, on that point as well.
This was a great discussion. Zach, Mauricio, Kadar, thank you so much for taking the time with us today.
Excellent.
Thank you.
And thank you to all of our listeners for joining us today. Our presenters will soon publish an article covering the insights we discussed and more, titled Unleashing the Power of Midcap Companies. So keep an eye out for that on McKinsey.com, and we will update it in the show notes when it's available. We'd welcome your feedback and ideas for future podcasts. Our email is ITSR, that stands for Inside the Strategy Room, at McKinsey.com. And you can also share your ratings and reviews on any podcast player, with many thanks to everyone who's already done so. We really appreciate all of your comments and feedback and encourage you to please keep them coming. If you enjoyed this episode and you would like to subscribe, you can follow our weekly series on any podcast player, where you can also access our entire library of previous episodes. Finally, if you'd like to automatically receive our latest publications and insights, we encourage you to sign up for email alerts on our insights page at McKinsey.com or connect with us on LinkedIn at the McKinsey Strategy and Corporate Finance practice page. You can also keep up to date on our latest insights from our transformation practice on LinkedIn by connecting with the community there. And you'll find a link to both of those pages in the show notes today. Thanks again for listening. We look forward to having you join us again next week inside the Strategy Room.